he'll put the blocking device so he can't set a route into that track. Or for maintenance way purposes. Maintenance way people get out, they work on the railroad. They don't shunt the tracks there. They don't cause the red lights to come on. So that's the protection for them. He has to put the blocking devices up here to protect them so he doesn't set a signal into them.
4M Dean, BDA, 18 AM. Maintain your Dean at CP 32. Authorized to use number 1 switch till 8:50 AM. Within CP 32 interlocking. Other info none.
Time effective 8:18 AM. Maintainer Dean. CP 32. Authorized to use number 1 switch until 8:50 AM. Within CP 32 interlocking. No information.
All right.
Now that is an example of what I was just talking about. That is a track car permit form M he just issued, which he's got to, will not show up on the board. So therefore he has to physically protect it on the control panel.
How many trains can you control at one time from in here?
He controls them all.
At one given time, I mean.
About 20
In other words,
minutes.
5, 10, 15, they all come out of here, though, right? The whole system is linked right through here.
Right. We control from Newell all the way to Youngstown. And also the York branch from Connellsville to McKeesport. He controls it all.
How long of a shift do these gentlemen work?
8 hours. This is manned around the clock, 3 tricks, you know, first, second, and third, 7 to 3, 3 to 11, 11 to 7, 7 days a week. Somebody here continually.
Chuck Craig is the Director of Public Relations for Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad. We got a chance to spend a lot of time with him. And Chuck Craig tells us, of course, that the decision to close down 1501 was a very hard one to make. But he says that more people are driving these days, and it's just not feasible to keep this line on anymore.
Chuck, let's talk a little history first about the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad. Briefly, how did it get its start?
Well, the railroad was incorporated back in 1875 by a group of local businessmen. Commerce and industry in the Pittsburgh area had been very captive to the Pennsylvania Railroad. New York Central Railroad was never able to get into the Pittsburgh area, and local businessmen decided they wanted an alternative to the Pennsylvania Railroad. So P&LE was started back in 1875. Construction began shortly after incorporation, and by 1879 we began service in February of that year.
When we speak of common carriers, let's say airlines, for instance, some have a fleet of 190 planes, 200 planes. What does Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad's fleet consist of?
Well, currently we have most of our service is predominantly freight service. And as you know, our last commuter service will terminate in July. We currently have 5 passenger coaches, which is the smallest portion of our fleet. We have almost 14,000 freight cars of various types, shapes, and sizes, nearly 100 locomotives. We're predominantly a freight carrier, concentrating primarily in iron, steel, coal, heavy commodity traffic.
When we talk about stopping the run between Beaver Falls and Pittsburgh, why was the decision made to do that, and who made the decision?
Well, I think you have to look at kind of the history of passenger traffic in the country. In the late 1800s, the early 1900s, rail traffic was the only way to travel. We started our freight operations in, I believe it was February 10th of 1879. 2 weeks later, we began our first passenger operation. By the mid-1800s, the average passenger trip was 19 miles at that time. I guess in the heydays, we got up to maybe around 5.5 million passengers running on P&LE in the 1920s. From that time, it began dwindling, and by, it was around the 1950s, we were down to about 1.25 million. It dwindled that far. You started seeing automobiles becoming more readily available with the pricing, delivery systems. One other factor, trucks started hauling freight back and forth. Inner-city buses began operating. All this took away from the passenger traffic. For years, the railroads utilized the mail service to help to subsidize and to be able to make a profit off of passenger operations. Well, in the 50s, the mail service went to trucks, and it cut a considerable amount of revenue. Consequently, when that happens, you end up cutting a number of trains. The service does not run as frequently. When it doesn't run as frequently, other modes may run more frequently, such as buses. The automobile became a real favorite. The highways were improved and became more convenient to utilize other modes of transportation. In the 50s and 60s, you saw the growth of the airlines with more frequent airline service, much faster service. That impacted on passenger traffic. This year, at our current rates, on an annualized basis, we'd probably be down to around 30 to 35,000 passengers a year. It's just been a losing proposition, even with government subsidies, and it's to a point that it's necessary to curtail the service.
How much money have you lost on that Beaver Falls to Pittsburgh run?
The last full year was ending June 30th of 1984. I think the total losses were around $625,000, of which we did receive slightly over $500,000 in state subsidies. So it's even with the subsidy, with the passenger revenue, we still lost well over $100,000 on the service. One of the big problems was the equipment is aging. It does need replaced. There are no governmental funds available for that. We cannot invest money in new equipment where we will have absolutely no return, and in fact lose money on it. It's just not a wise business decision. If we were to continue operating the service, new equipment would be required, and estimates have run anywhere from $800,000 to around $1.5 million for new equipment, which we are not prepared to lay out.
The 85 or so passengers who ride this train now from Beaver Falls to Pittsburgh and back every day, when you make a decision, on the corporate level to stop that, do they take into consideration inconvenience at all, or is it just something that's just monetarily, you just can't do it?
No, inconvenience is looked at. That is one of the factors, but the Public Utility Commission did hold a hearing in February of this year, of which the railroad presented its case concerning why the train should be discontinued. The public presented their case. There's no question that it may be inconvenient. There are other forms of public transportation. There is concern on our part, and I'm sure concern on the part of the PUC for passenger safety. If we were to continue the service, it's essential that we have new equipment, and we are not prepared to put new equipment in service to lose money on. all factors were looked at. There is a convenience factor that they did look at. The commission did indicate, yes, it would be inconvenient, but there were alternative services available to the passengers.
Wasn't there an injunction or something, a group that was trying to get the, in other words, to have Pittsburgh Lake Erie Railroad, continue the service and try to stop it? What's happening with that court case?
There's no court case to my knowledge. They have petitioned the PUC. When we petitioned to abandon the service, they petitioned to continue the service, brought their representatives and presented their case at the hearing conducted by an administrative law judge for the PUC. The group, I believe they refer to it as the Save the Train Committee, has been a very active group, has been a very vocal group. They've been very strong supporters, and frankly, all of our riders have been very strong supporters of continuing the service. Frankly, we hate to lose them. It's just unfortunate that that group of loyal riders was not larger. Had it been larger, had we been able to at least break even and perhaps make a profit on the operation, I'm sure we would not have made the decision that we did make. I'm sure it was very difficult back in 1967, when at that time we were running 5 commuter trains a day between Pittsburgh and points west. In 1967, it was cut down to 1 train per day because of the ridership. The ridership continued to decline. We first began looking at discontinuing the operations in 1977, and at that time did petition to abandon the service. As a result of that petition, and a group of the riders, whether it was the same Save the Train Committee or not, mustered forces and worked with the various counties and transit authorities, where we did begin getting subsidized subsidies for our operations in late 78 or 79. That has continued there, and in each year we have not been kept whole on our operating losses, even with the subsidies. The group was, I'm sure, very unhappy when we announced and we filed for abandonment of the service again. There's a certain nostalgia to any railroad, and especially rail passenger traffic. As I said, we've had a good group of very loyal riders. We hate to lose them. We hate to see them go. It's just unfortunate that there were not more of them.
Do you foresee down the line more of the passenger runs being curtailed or shut down completely?
To our knowledge, our operation is the last privately operated commuter rail system, at least in the eastern United States and perhaps in the entire country. Any of your other commuter rail operations are basically operated by transit authorities. Your largest passenger rail operation is Amtrak, the National Rail Passenger Service, that operates all over the country. But on a regional basis, on a local basis, commuter rail service is now being provided by local transit authorities. And like everything else, whether that service continues depends upon the ridership. If the ridership is high enough, it should probably continue. And if it falls and operating expenses increase to where it becomes a substantially losing proposition, unless the taxpayers are willing to put up additional monies to cover the operating losses, the service will be discontinued.
How is that decision made? Do they look at it for the last 5 years, last 3 years, last year, then finally say we just can't take it anymore? How do they actually make that rendering or that decision to actually stop it?
Well, on the privately owned railroads, for many years, have realized that passenger service was not their forte. Basically, they're freight railroads. For years, we continued passenger service as a community service. When I came to the railroad nearly 10 years ago, I was amazed to find that at that time we were subsidizing the passenger service to the tune of 50 cents a share in earnings, which was rather expensive community relations, I thought. The privately owned railroads determined that they would invest their capital, concentrate on their freight operations, and little by little abandon service or turned it over to municipal authorities, transit authorities, to operate. They went through the various state abandonment procedures depending upon where their railroads operated within.
What happens to the depots?
In many cases, we have already sold many of our old stations. At this point, we may have some land that is still used for parking. Our real estate department will be handling those matters, determining whether they will be sold. In all probability, what stations do remain within the ownership probably will be sold. Many of them have already been sold and are held by someone else.
Now, you have the train that the crew, we rode down on, number 1501, all right? The passenger cars, what will happen to those cars? Will they be mothballed, or what do you do with them?
No, at this point, we are looking at making them available for sale. We have already done some advertising of their availability, requesting bids for the purchase of those. We will also consider selling the locomotives. The locomotives can be used in yard service. However, the locomotives are unique from a standpoint that they do have a steam generating capacity to them that most of your yard road locomotives do not have, so they are kind of unique. Even though, believe it or not, the locomotives are over 30 years old. But they have been well maintained. They're in excellent condition, and they are kind of unique.
And what about the various conductors and the engineer, the fireman? What happens to people like that?
Well, their seniority will enable them to hold other jobs on the railroad. They will go back into freight service rather than into passenger service. It's quite possible we may have a retirement or two. There's been a story floating around for quite some time that our conductor may retire following the last run, with the distinction of being the conductor on the last passenger train on the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad. Whether that will take place or not, that's his decision, but it has been rumored for some time.
There have been many efforts to save 1501. The Committee to Save the Train is just one of many. However, it won't change Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad officials' minds. 1501 is now a thing of the past. It's part of a history that is just no longer. So for everybody who used to ride train number 1501, Pittsburgh and Lake Erie officials would like to sincerely thank you for your support over the years. And they are unhappy that you had to take the last train ride. This is Dave Bernard, TV 14.
As I said before, we hate to see it go. I get nostalgic myself, having been here for a few years, and I hate to see the passenger service go. Unfortunately, it came down to a hard business decision. We certainly appreciate the patronage of the customers and our passengers that we've had for years and years. People have a lot of fond memories of their trips on P&LE, coming into the terminal, and we certainly appreciate their patronage for the service that we have provided.